The Bible that you read today is not the same as the one that Jesus Christ read 2,000 years ago. There are books in your Bible today that were not there back then. And there are books in the Old Testament that Jesus Christ would have read that are not in our Bibles today. Today, we're going to talk about one of those books in particular. We're going to talk about the lost Apocrypha of the Old Testament and how it may have looked like. I remember the first time I heard about this. I was in Bible college, and I was reading through some extra books that were not part of my curriculum, and I came across something called the Apocrypha. I looked at the word Apocrypha. It said, here's some books that are not accepted by most scholars or most churches today, but they were included in the Catholic Bible for many years. So I started looking at them, and I began to realize that they had books like Tobit, Judith, Maccabees 1st and 2nd, and these stories were in the Bible that I grew up reading. I didn't know they weren't in other people's Bibles. So let me start by defining what are the apocryphal books. The Apocrypha is a collection of 14 books that were written between the years 200 BC and 1st century AD. They were included in the Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint, but they were excluded from the Hebrew Bible. The term Apocrypha comes from the Greek word apokryphos, which means hidden or secret. And this is because many Christians believe that these books were not inspired by God and therefore should not be read or followed. Now, the reason why there are different versions of the Bible is because there were different translations over the course of history. One of the oldest and most important translations is called the Septuagint, which was completed around the year 3rd century BC. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that was used by early Christians. The Septuagint includes the books of the Hebrew Bible, as well as the Apocrypha. Okay, so why did the early church include these books if they weren't inspired? Well, the early church included the Apocrypha in the Septuagint because they believed that these books were part of the Old Testament canon. They also believed that these books were useful for teaching and for correcting people's wrong beliefs. The Apocrypha can be divided into two groups, the deuterocanonical books and the non-canonical books. The deuterocanonical books are the books that were written after the Old Testament canon was closed. These books are Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, Letter of Jeremiah, Prayer of Azariah, Song of the Three Holy Young Men, and Odes of Solomon. These books were accepted by the early church as part of the Old Testament canon. However, they are not considered to be inspired by God. The non-canonical books are the books that were written before the Old Testament canon was closed. These books are Genesis, the Ascension of Isaiah, the Testament of Abraham, the story of Joseph and Asenath, the Book of Jubilees, the Apocalypse of Moses, the Book of Enoch, the history of the Rechabites, and 3rd and 4th Esdras. These books are not considered to be part of the Old Testament canon, but they are still important for understanding the history of the Bible and the development of Christian thought. So why did they fall out of the Bible? Well, several factors led to the exclusion of the Apocrypha from the Protestant Bible. One factor was the Council of Trent, which was a council of the Catholic Church that met from 1545 to 1563. The council defined the Catholic doctrine and reaffirmed the authority of the Pope. The council also decided which books were to be included in the Catholic Bible. The Council of Trent decided that the Apocrypha should be included in the Catholic Bible, but they were not considered to be on the same level of inspiration as the other books. Another factor was the Reformation, which was a movement that began in the 16th century that aimed to reform the Catholic Church. Martin Luther, John Calvin, and other reformers rejected the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church. They also rejected the Apocrypha as being part of the Old Testament canon. And finally, there were some biblical scholars who argued that the Apocrypha was not written in Hebrew. They also argued that the Apocrypha was not quoted in the New Testament and therefore should not be considered to be part of the Old Testament canon. What are some of the key events described in the Lost Apocrypha? One of the most well-known books in the Apocrypha is the Book of Tobit. This book tells the story of a man named Tobit who is blind and cannot find work. His son Tobias helps him get money by collecting his wages. On the way home, Tobias meets a young woman named Raguel, and he helps her cross a river. Raguel turns out to be the daughter of an important official, and she asks Tobias for help in finding a husband. Tobias agrees, and he and Raguel get married. After the wedding, Tobias returns home with his new wife and his father's money. Tobit recognizes his son's voice and is overjoyed. He is able to find work again, and he and his family live happily ever after. Another interesting book in the Apocrypha is the Book of Judith. This book tells the story of a young woman named Judith who lives in the town of Bethulia. The Assyrian general Holofernes is trying to destroy the town, and he demands that the townspeople surrender. The townspeople refuse, and Holofernes lays siege to the town. Judith decides to take matters into her own hands. She disguises herself as a prostitute and sneaks into Holofernes' tent. She seduces him and then beheads him. Judith returns to Bethulia a hero, and the townspeople defeat the Assyrians. So what do believers in the Apocrypha believe? Believers in the Apocrypha believe that these books are inspired by God and that they should be included in the Bible. They believe that these books teach important lessons and provide valuable insights into the history and culture of the Jews during the time of Jesus. Some believers also believe that these books contain important information about the Messiah and his mission. How does it compare to the Bible that we have today? The Bible that most Christians read today is called the Protestant Bible. It includes the books of the Old Testament that were written in Hebrew, as well as the New Testament. The Old Testament includes the Torah, the history books, the poetry books, the major prophets, and the minor prophets. The New Testament tells the story of Jesus Christ and his disciples. So let me answer the questions that you might be having. Is the Apocrypha part of the Bible? Well, not according to most Protestants, but it was part of the Bible that Jesus would have read. That's right. According to the Catholic Church, the Bible contains 73 books, including the 46 books of the Old Testament, the 27 books of the New Testament, and the 14 books of the Apocrypha. Protestants, on the other hand, believe that the Bible contains only 66 books. Why did the Catholics add the extra books? In the Catholic view, these extra books were added to the Bible because they provide a fuller understanding of the history and culture of the Jews during the time of Jesus. Additionally, they provide valuable insights into the teachings of Jesus and his disciples. And what about the Book of Enoch? Now, the Book of Enoch is not included in the Catholic Bible. It was originally written in Hebrew, but it was not part of the Old Testament canon. It was included in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but it is not part of the Bible as a whole. So, should you read the Apocrypha? Yes, I think it's worth reading. Many of these books contain important historical and cultural information about the Jews during the time of Jesus. They also provide valuable insights into the teachings of Jesus and his disciples. Additionally, they are just interesting stories that can help us understand the world in which Jesus lived. One thing to keep in mind is that the Apocrypha was written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Therefore, you will need to read it in a translation. There are a few different translations available, but I recommend using the new Revised Standard Version. If you're interested in learning more about the Bible, I encourage you to check out our other videos. Thank you for watching.